a short video on the other gas laws. Um, it is essential that we understand both what the three main gas laws associated with pulmonary function actually say, as well as how they help describe respiratory function. And so in a previous video, we talked about Boyle's law and how it helps describe ventilation. In this video, I would like to describe and explain Dalton's law. And then after that one, we'll talk a little bit about Henry's law. And Dalton's law really is going to help us understand why the pressure of of oxygen at the alveolar surface, at the lung surface, is not the same as the air we breathe in. Okay, and so let's walk you through that one. So let's just look at a sample of air at sea level. And that air is going to have a pressure that we describe as P atmosphere, or P ATM. And it's going to equal about, again, if it's at sea level, it's almost exactly 760 millimeters of mercury. Of course, the farther you go up in altitude, the lower the pressure becomes, total pressure, and as well as the pressures of the individual gases in air. Anyway, so atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury. This is our units, millimeters of mercury. And the thing about air is that it is not a single gas. It's actually a very complex gas mixture. The good news is it's predominantly two gases. And those two gases are nitrogen and oxygen. Right? So that's mostly what we're breathing. Now, there are 1,000 other gases in air, but they're found there in sort of really low amounts. And so what we can just do here is put the partial pressure of, X, any other gas, right? And again, plus dot, dot, dot. We can keep going and going. But remember, the first two are going to make up 99 point, something percent, almost 100%. And actually, I'm going to round our numbers, so it's going to look like there's nothing but nitrogen and oxygen. And if we put percents on these, the nitrogen is about 79%, or 0.79 of the total. And oxygen is, of course, the other percentage, 0.21. So add those two together and you end up with 1, right? 100%. And so if we want to know the partial pressure of oxygen in air, again, all we have to really do is multiply this fraction by the total, right? So PO2, and again, this would be in air, would equal the total pressure of air, 760, and again, millimeters of mercury, times the fraction that's made up of oxygen, 0.21, and I'll round this off a little bit, and we end up with 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay? All right, well, where's Dalton's law in here? Well, Dalton's law is this first line. Dalton's law basically says that the pressure, total pressure of a gas mixture is equal to the partial pressures of the individual gases in it, right? And so Dalton's law is this first line. And again, it doesn't have to be air. It could be any gas mixture. We're just using air as an example, right? And so Dalton's law basically says the partial pressure of nitrogen plus the partial pressure of oxygen plus the partial pressure of anything else there, some carbon dioxide and methane and 1,000 other things, water vapor even, would add up to the total, or provide the total pressure of that gas, right? And again, if you looked in, if you filled a balloon with air, right, you could, let's do it, right? If we have a balloon filled with air, right, we tied it off, and we can put, colors for our individual gases here, and I'll have the the red dots here being the nitrogen, right? Again, it would be, this isn't going to be exact, right? But we would be 79% nitrogen, and we'll pick another color that stands out here. We have oxygen in green, right, being only about 1/5, right, as much. I have to stop here right about now, right? Maybe even went a little too far, right? So it's mostly nitrogen, and the pressure within this balloon, add a couple more nitrogens here, the pressure on the walls of this balloon, right, from these two gases generates the total pressure. Now, if it's in a balloon, it's going to be higher than the 760 we talked about here because it's being compressed by the balloon. But the idea still holds, right? Whatever the pressure is inside the balloon is going to be the sum of, it's going to be 79% of that pressure will be due to nitrogen, again, because it's air, and 21% would be oxygen. Now, all right, so really that was the whole point of using Dalton's law, because now if I come down here and sketch a really schematic lung, right, trachea, lung, right, there's a trachea, right, and so we're breathing in and out of this trachea, and the air we're breathing in and out has a PO2 of 160. Right? Always millimeters of mercury. Now you might say, okay, well that means the PO2, right, of that air that's, with each inhalation, right, the PO2 now we can sort of exaggerate and say, okay, it's not a lung, it's an individual alveolus, right? And it doesn't really matter which, but if we're just thinking about the air that's entering an alveolus, you might say, oh, okay, so it's going to be a PO2 of 160 down here, right? Wrong, right? That is incorrect. And it is incorrect because we are, and a lot of organisms are, tidal breathers. Right? It's called bidirectional. Another description of it is bidirectional ventilation. Right? And this is actually shown by this arrow right here. Right here, right? Like think of the tides. What do the tides do? They go in, they go out, they go in, they go out, right? Bidirectional, two directions, right? Going in and out and in and out. What that means is we're breathing in and out of this blind-ended bag. It's not a flow-through system. There are animals that have a flow-through system. Think about a fish, right? A fish pulls water in and not breathing air. They're breathing water, right? They're extracting oxygen from the water. But the water comes in through their mouth and then exits through their gill slits, right? That's not tidal ventilation, right? That's unidirectional ventilation. It's one direction. Birds actually have a mechanism of unidirectional ventilation. It's actually a better model for getting high PO2 air down here. But we do not, right? Because we're bringing this air in and we do not collapse our lungs with each exhalation, the air that's coming in, the oxygen that's coming in, is being diluted by the gases that are already down there, right? And so you're going to end up with a PO2 here of, it's about 105. I'm just going to round it down and call it 100. Right? And again, millimeters of mercury. So it's actually less. All right, well, why do we care, right? Well, let me make the wall of our, and again, we'll think of this as the alveolus. I'm going to add the cells here, the squamous cells of our alveolus, right? And I'm going to add a capillary right next door, and there'll be a basement membrane sort of surrounding this. All right, let's have a basement membrane here, right, in the blue. Probably exaggerating the thickness of it here. All right, that blue is the basement membrane. Remember, that's that extracellular component that's secreted by the cells. It's extracellular proteins. That's the basement membrane. It's got a complex structure and whatever. Okay, we don't care. Not that we don't care, but we don't need that information right now. So let's add the let's add our capillaries here. And I'm not going to try to draw all of them, right? But those capillaries would sit right up against here, right? And I'm going to draw one that's a little bigger so I can squeeze some things into it. A larger capillary, right? Also made up of those squamous flat cells. And again, that's really good for diffusion. We would have red blood cells in here. I'll squeeze one in here. Right? Here's a red blood cell for carrying the oxygen. And the whole point of this discussion relative to Dalton's law is that, right, atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen is not equal to the total pressure of the gas, right? 160 is only, a fifth of the 760. The rest is nitrogen. And are we breathing in the nitrogen? Sure we are. Do we do anything with it? Nope. Right? It's just not used metabolically for any purpose. And so we don't have to discuss it. But the oxygen, right, comes in at 160 and ends up being diluted down to about 100. And again, one of the reasons for that is the CO2 in this alveolar air is going to equal about 40. Well, in air out here, right, we didn't even include it, right? And so it's actually much less than 1 millimeter of mercury. I didn't even write it down, right? It's not even, where's the CO2 up here? I didn't write it down, right? And I didn't write it down because it's such a small fraction that most people just sort of leave it out, right? When you're talking about the big picture. But remember, our bodies are producing CO2 and we're diffusing CO2 into the alveolar air. And so the concentration there is going to be much higher, right, than it is in regular air or out in the atmosphere. Okay. Now, remember when we talked about Boyle's law, right, this is 760 out here, right, again, at sea level. And what's the pressure in here? What's the total pressure in here? We call that P alveolar or intrapulmonary pressure, if you prefer. And it's variable because we're breathing, right? We're driving our ventilation by changing pressures. We talked about that with Boyle's law. But really it's approximately 760. Now it can't sit right at 760 indefinitely. You have no gradient, right? But it's going 759, 761, or 755, 765, depending on how hard you're breathing. But on average it's 760. Which means, right, we added a gas here, right? And actually, we could also add right down the gas component of water is much higher. It's very humidified air once we breathe it in. So that's in there, which means the partial pressure of oxygen can't be 160. It's being diluted by these other gases, the water vapor as a gas and the carbon dioxide, right? And so that's going to bring that 160 down to about 100 at the alveolar surface. Okay, and again, all right, whatever. It's at 100 instead of 160. Whoop-de-doo, right? Who cares? Well, we care because we need oxygen to diffuse from the alveolar air into the blood. And what drives that diffusion is delta C, right? Delta C equals C1 minus C2, the concentrations in these two regions. Well, here's C1 and here's C2. Well, what is C2? It's the concentration of oxygen in the blood at the pulmonary capillaries, right? The capillaries surrounding the alveoli. So I'm going to write down this PO2 equals, and it's variable. I'm going to say 20 to 40 or 50. I'll write 40. Again, the number is not that essential, right? Notice it is significantly less than it is in the alveolus. Why is it less? Where did this pulmonary blood just come from? Well, it just came from the heart, right? The right heart pumped the blood to the pulmonary circuit. Where did it come from before that? It came from the body. In other words, where the blood was distributing, dropping off oxygen, right? And so these values are low PO2 values. for blood, right? In other words, that is deoxygenated blood. It's not fully deoxygenated, but we use that term anyway. Well, that's as it's coming in. It's coming in at, again, depending on how active you are, somewhere between 20 and 40. At rest, it's coming in at about 40. It goes down. We deliver more to the tissues during exercise, and we might drop down to 20 or even lower. Now, is it going to stay there? Nope. We keep supplying oxygen through ventilation to the alveoli to keep it at about 100 millimeters of mercury. And because of that gradient, we're going to keep driving diffusion in this direction. Now, the 100 is not going to change unless you hold your breath and stop breathing. The 100 is going to stay 100. But what's going to happen to these values? These values are going to become right? They're going to equilibrate with this, right? That is the whole point of pulmonary blood flow, is to equilibrate the oxygen in the alveolar air, in the lung air, with the blood, right? And again, we'll find out in a subsequent video that at this 100 millimeters of mercury, at that pressure of oxygen in the blood, we are completely saturated. You essentially can't get more in, right? The hemoglobin is carrying essentially as much oxygen as it possibly can, right? And there's your sort of, if you want to think of it this way, that's your adaptive driving point for having this PO2 of 100 being the again, approximately 100 being the value that we maintain it as, is because at that value, once it equilibrates with blood, the blood's saturated with oxygen, right? That's what you want. You want your blood to be saturated with oxygen at the lungs, so it can go back off to the, again, to the heart first, but then to the tissues, and be fully capable of delivering oxygen to those tissues. Okay? So that's Dalton's law, and it's explaining the generation of the partial pressures of gases. And again, we're going to have to look at those partial pressures of gases to determine our delta C. And again, that is from Fick. You can't hide from Fick, right? Fick's first law has basically says that concentration gradients drive diffusion, right? There's a bunch of other factors in there, and we have a video on that. But the concentration gradient drives the diffusion, and the difference between 100 and 40 is sufficient to have, or 20, that's even bigger, right? Is sufficient to equilibrate the blood with this oxygen in the alveolar air. Okay, so good diffusion with that size concentration gradient. Now, we could talk about carbon dioxide, and the diffusion gradient is the exact opposite direction. Let me put the PCO2 in here, just so we can think about that for just a second. Equals about 45, right? Aha, so 45 here. Look what it was in the alveolar air, 40. Which way is it diffusing? I already have an arrow, right? It's going to diffuse downhill toward the lower concentration. So CO2 is moving out of the blood, O2 is moving into the blood. You'll notice the gradient is much smaller, right? It's only 5 millimeters of mercury difference. You might think, wow, that's a small gradient. The diffusion is really going to be lousy, except for the fact that carbon dioxide much more readily moves in and out of gases, right? The solubility in liquid is greater, and so it's easier to maintain this or generate this equilibrium with carbon dioxide, even though the concentration gradient is smaller. Okay, that is Dalton's law. I'm going to talk a little bit about Henry's law, but I'll do it in a separate video.